On January 26, 1963, a special child was born to a special family in Setúbal, Portugal. The family named the newborn José Mario dos Santos Félix Mourinho. The world would know him years later as José Mourinho.
I think I'm a special one.
José was born into one of Setúbal's leading families. His mother was the daughter of a prominent businessman in the city, and his family was involved in football. For example, Mourinho's mother's uncle built the stadium of the city's team, Vitória Setúbal. Mourinho's father, Félix Mourinho, was one of the most important goalkeepers in the history of Vitória Setúbal. His fame went beyond the city, and he was transferred to a bigger team, Belenenses. Félix was also a Portuguese national team player. Mourinho grew up in a privileged and rich environment, but it was the Carnation Revolution that profoundly affected his life. When Mourinho was 11 years old, there was a military coup. Normally, military regimes are known for their brutality and killing democracy, but in Portugal, the opposite was the case. The leftist soldiers who carried out the coup had overthrown the dictatorial regime and replaced it with democracy. Not only that, Portugal withdrew from the countries it had colonized. This may seem like a good outcome for everyone, but for Mourinho and his big right-wing family, it would be devastating. At that time, the communists had won the municipal elections in Setúbal. This result was a sign of hard times ahead for the Mourinhos. And so it was. Everything of the Mourinho family was nationalized by the state except the house they lived in. The family was getting poorer and poorer. Father Félix Mourinho didn't want to stay in Portugal anymore and was looking for a club in Spain. Mourinho recalls those days. As a child, I had the opportunity to be friends with children from the richest families in the country. But at the same time, I got to know children in very poor conditions where life didn't give them any opportunities. I learned how to exist in these two extreme sides. Those days gave me very important life experiences. What made Mourinho a great manager was his human relationship with his players. He understood their situation. He owed this to the fact that at a very young age he knew people from all strata of society and learned how to communicate with them. José fell in love with soccer from an early age, going to training sessions when his father was already a goalkeeper, observing the environment and getting to know the locker room dynamics. His father wanted his son to be a soccer player like him. Little José wanted to be a football player like his father, not a businessman like what his mother wanted. In those years, Liverpool dominated European soccer, and José was a Liverpool fan and his idol was Kenny Dalglish. But as the years passed and Mourinho grew up, his father realized the truth. He didn't have the physical capacity to be a good soccer player, but José was obsessed with football. As a 19-year-old footballer at Rio Ave, he was analyzing opponents by himself. He was also well-liked by his teammates. He created a good atmosphere in the locker room. Years passed and José was 24 years old. He knew he wasn't going to be a good soccer player himself, but football was at the center of his life. His mother knew that he was very intelligent and disciplined and thought that he should not waste his talents on soccer. His mother believes he can be very successful in business life. That's why she wants him to study business. Mourinho didn't care about that. He was going to be interested in football no matter what. That's why he studied at the Sports Science Academy. During this education, the only field he gave his attention to was football. For 6 years, he worked as a youth academy coach, scout, and assistant coach at various clubs. But the first step that would lead him to professional life would not come from his knowledge of soccer, but from his knowledge of languages.
I prefer really not to speak. If I speak, I am in big trouble.
E sicuramente, se tu sei bravo le domande che tu mi hai dato.
3-0, c'est un résultat très important. Nous savons que si nous jouerons normalement,
Tenemos que ir ahí con todo orgullo, sin Pepe, que no ha hecho nada, sin Ramos, que no ha hecho nada.
In 1992, Sporting president Sousa Sintra brought Bobby Robson to the club. When Robson came to Sporting, he told Sintra that he wanted to come to the club, but he needed a translator who understood football, because Robson could only speak English. And he thought that the interpreter should explain things without taking them out of context. Sporting found the name they were looking for in Overense. Mourinho, the team's scout, was perfect for the task. The duo did not have a successful period with Sporting, but an important meeting for the history of football took place, and Robson and Mourinho's 7-year partnership began. Robson was not only an experienced coach, but also a well-qualified person. He was quick to recognize Mourinho's intelligence, and in interviews in the following years, he said of Mourinho that it was impossible not to see his brilliance. Every analysis he gave me was more meticulous and careful than I had ever seen before in my life. That's why he brought him to Porto, where he took over a month after he was fired from Sporting. Here he was, a assisting Robson without knowing that he would later become a legend. It was reported in the Portuguese press that he was earning 35,000 euros a year at the time. How could a translator earn that much money? Nobody realized that he was almost an assistant coach. In 2.5 seasons at Porto, the duo won the Portuguese League twice, the Portuguese Cup twice, and the Portuguese Super Cup twice. In 1994, they reached the semi-finals of the Champions League. The team was going from strength to strength and making waves in Europe. But the interesting thing was that Robson and Mourinho had the opposite football mentality. Robson let his players loose on the pitch, always wanting them to attack. At Porto, he always won different games, so journalists called him Bobby 5-0. Mourinho, on the other hand, had a hard defensive approach. The two were opposite to each other, which caused them to feed each other and become even more successful. Because of these achievements, he was going to Arsenal in 1995, but he stayed at Porto after the insistence of the Porto president of the time. However, when Barcelona made an offer a season later, the duo had no choice but to leave. In fact, Barcelona officials didn't want Mourinho to come at first. They wanted Robson to work with their own assistant coach, but at Robson's insistence, they brought the Portuguese to Spain. At first, they gave him a very small salary and let him stay in one of President Josep Luis Núñez's hotels. But when Núñez realized how important Mourinho was, he got him an apartment and increased his annual salary to $300,000. During his Barcelona years, Mourinho worked with Figo, Stoichkov, Laurent Blanche, Pep Guardiola, and Ronaldo Nazario, who years later he said was the best player he had ever seen. But in every great love, there is a great hatred. The more we love something, the more likely we are to hate it. Because when our love is not reciprocated, the resentment we feel will eventually turn into anger. Mourinho felt part of Barcelona, not knowing that years later he would become the club's worst enemy. His relationship with Robson was no longer that of a colleague. It had turned into a father-son relationship. The two lived in the same apartment building and spent their free time together. Coincidentally, the two were fans of Anthony Hopkins and watched movies starring him together. On the pitch, they won the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup, Copa del Rey, and the Spanish Super Cup in a single season. During the celebrations after winning the Copa del Rey, Mourinho shouted in Catalan, "Today, tomorrow, and always, Barcelona will be in my heart." Pep Guardiola, who in those years was his best friend at the club, would become his main enemy in the future. He and Guardiola liked each other a lot because Guardiola was not only a player on the pitch, but also a tactician. That's why he made Mourinho's job easier. But the first blow to Mourinho from Barcelona was the sacking of Bobby Robson, whom he considered his father. Mou wanted to leave the club with him, but Robson, who no longer saw him as an employee but as his son, refused to let him leave Barcelona. "You are not coming with me. You will stay here and work for Van Gaal in Barcelona. Don't miss this opportunity," he said, and ended their 6-year relationship. Life is like that. Sometimes someone comes along and you live your best days with them, and you think these days will never end. But the world is not all about you. It revolves around the sun, time progresses, the world changes, people change, and those days when you were happy are left behind. Robson had experienced this many times, and he knew that at some point he would part ways with Mourinho, and he felt that the right moment had come. So a new chapter in Mourinho's life began. Physical education teacher, youth coach, interpreter, and assistant coach. Next up, a new manager who would take the world by storm.